Hey guys, welcome to Friday and the bird that just flew into my window. That was entertaining. I hope he's okay. Anyway, we're going to talk Democritus this morning, and Democritus as part of the group that we refer to as the natural philosophers. I think this is about the fifth time I've made this video because of a variety of things that have gone wrong, from the audio not turning out properly to the video not cooperating right to a whole host of things that have gone wrong. And in all of that, you hopefully will still get something that is my best and not full of the frustration that has been trying to get this recorded for you. So, to that end, let's remind ourselves of a couple of things. Number one, we're talking about the natural philosophers. Natural philosophers are a group that we would probably more readily identify with scientists than philosophers today, in part because contemporary science likes to overstep its boundaries and make philosophical statements based on the scientific evidence that's at their disposal. Secondly, we would talk about natural philosophers as scientists because they are primarily concerned with the mechanisms of the world, what exists and how it exists, the process that brought those things into existence, and things like that. So, those tendencies to explain the things of the natural world is what leads us to call them natural philosophers. It's also what leads us to think of them more in terms of scientists, and people trying to explain the mechanics of the existence that we get to experience here. Their tagline, so long as we're just remembering properly, their tagline is, nothing can come from nothing. If we have no things, nothing, then you cannot get something from no things. It does not make sense to the natural philosopher, and I think we would share this opinion as Christians. It does not make sense to us that if you have no things, all of a sudden you have everything, because you need at least one thing to start the process of all of the other things. And this is the basic premise of the natural philosophers. So then, like we talked about on Thursday, which is today when I'm recording this, but it's yesterday for you when you're watching this, what is the primary something? And how does that primary something produce a bunch of other things? Well, remember that for most of the natural philosophers, whatever that primary something is that is responsible for producing all of the other things that we have, whatever it is eternal in both directions. It has always existed, and it will continue to always exist. And it's probably going to be unchanging. Because it's eternal, not bound by time, and because everything else is dependent upon it, it being able to change and be something different or something like that doesn't make sense to the natural philosophers. So whatever the thing or things are that give rise to everything else that exists, like if it's earth or wind or fire or, yes, pun intended, or any of those other sort of basic building blocks, then what that is, it will always be that thing, and it will always exist in those ways. While it might combine or be arranged in such a fashion as to give rise to the things that we see, okay? For our purposes in both this class and for today, I want to show you a resource. This is a resource that you are going to use and you are going to need to use on a consistent basis, and it is called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, I've searched it obviously before. I've used it a ton. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. We go here. It is produced by Stanford University. It is a searchable database of all things philosophy, in fact, an encyclopedia. And it is significant and important for us because it is a sort of one-stop shop for all of the things that we are going to need to know in terms of philosophy for this class. So if we come in here and we search for Democritus, who is our focus for the morning, and we pull him up, we're going to get him at the top of the pile, and we can click on this and go to his particular page. And then there's Leucippus, who is another philosopher connected to Democritus. There's ancient atomism, which we're going to have to talk about as we talk about Democritus. Pre-Socratic philosophy, the sophists, there's a whole bunch of context here. The one that we want is this one, on Democritus. So when we get to a space where we're going to search or do a study for people like Plato, just come into the search bar and type Plato. And you do your search for Plato, and it will pull up information. Once we get here to this page, there is a ton of information that we can look at, and I'll make this a little bit bigger for us and do some zoom in for us, but there's a ton of information in here, okay? This page will have all of the primary information that we need for this philosopher. If we want to go look at ancient atomism or some of these other pieces that were connected to him in our first search, that's great. He might appear on those pages, and so we should pay attention, but this is kind of going to be our one-stop shop. You're going to need to use this source as you do your in-depth study for all of your character journal elements for your in-depth exploration for all of these different philosophers, okay? Okay. As we talk about Democritus, we can just start with some basics. He's born on the northern Aegean coast in a place called Abdera in Greece in the year 460 BC, and he dies in the year 370 BC. He is a natural philosopher and primarily concerned with the way that things exist and how and why they exist in those ways. So he is going to talk to us, and we are going to listen primarily to his work related to what's called atomist doctrine. Atomist doctrine is the teaching that all things are composed of atoms. Now, atoms for Democritus aren't necessarily like the atoms that we would think of today, a nucleus with electrons and things like that. But where Democritus is coming from is, hey, I can take a tree, for example, and I can chop that tree down and I can cut it into pieces, and I'm gonna eventually get to pieces of that tree that I can no longer cut. They'll be so small that I can't cut them anymore. There must then be, this is his logic, there must then be some kind of not visible to the naked eye building block that produces the tree. If I can break the tree down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until I get to pieces of the tree that compose it but are so small I can't cut them anymore, then that must be what arranges together to form the tree. And he calls those atoms. He calls them atoms, those basic building blocks, because the word atom in Greek means uncuttable. And so what he's talking about is there are basic particles that are arranged to produce the tree. There are basic particles that are arranged to produce the table or shields and swords. And those basic building blocks, those basic pieces or particles, cannot be subdivided any further. They're the smallest things that produce all other things. What produces the variety of things that we see in the world around us is the different kinds and the different arrangements of those atoms. So those tiny, non-dividable building blocks have different sorts, different kinds, and they are sorted and arranged in different ways to produce different things. So gold and bronze and wood and human beings, and we can arrange those atoms, or those atoms are arranged in different ways. And as they are arranged in different ways, they produce the different thing that we can see and notice in the world around us. we can then manipulate the way that those atoms are arranged as well, and we can take a tree and we can turn it into like tables and chairs and things like that, logs for buildings, and we can take stones and carve them. And so we can adjust some of the arrangement to the atoms, but we can't necessarily create the arrangement. We can alter the arrangement when we do things like metal alloys, and we can bring things together in different ways. But the things themselves are created by the arrangement of the atoms, and we cannot break something down further than the atom, whatever that is, however it is, that's what it is. Now, for him, that means then that the one thing that has always existed and will always exist, that is eternal and that is unchangeable, is the atom. Now again, there's different types of atoms, so what he says is there's an infinite variety of atoms to produce the infinite variety of arrangements that exists in our natural world. Second, atoms don't change. So the fire atom is the fire atom, will always be the fire atom. It might be arranged in certain things, like a human person, to produce the human soul. So for Democritus, the human soul seems to be most likely composed of things like fire atoms, because the human soul is a place of the passions, because it's a place of intensity, because it's where we believe the mind and enlightenment resides, and so fire has light and heat and passion and intensity, and so too does the human soul. So, there it is. It must be composed of fire atoms. Human beings, let's just take that as an example, come to exist because atoms come together and form an arrangement that produces a human being. When that human being dies, the atoms then disintegrate, and this is sort of very technically speaking. They've integrated in a particular arrangement to create the human person. And when that human being dies, the atoms are then disarranged. They disintegrate, and they can then be rearranged into other things. So too the elements of the human soul. The atoms that form the human soul come together and are arranged to form a soul. And when that human being dies, the body disintegrates, but so too does the human soul. It disintegrates, and those atoms are now free to move about and be reintegrated and become something different, perhaps even be parts of a different soul, because the atom never changes, and the atom is always present. Its arrangement is what gives rise to our existence, which really means there isn't anything after this life. There's different arrangements of this life, but there really isn't anything that transcends it. Atoms are eternal and immutable. They can't be destroyed. And really, they're the only thing that exists. They're the only thing that exists. That and the void. Atoms exist because the combinations of atoms gives rise to other things. The void exists because atoms need a kind of space, a kind of emptiness to move around in, to arrange themselves in these particular ways. Motion is key and critical to arrangement. Atoms move, and as they get into proximity with one another, they arrange themselves in particular ways. And in that arrangement, they become the things that we can see and know. And so what we have to have is a kind of space. But for him, the void is the emptiness. It's not space like we would think of it. Space for us is like this air in front of me. It's made up of particles. Outer space is a vacuum where those things and those elements and those particles are there, but they're just extremely spread out. So this emptiness gives room for the atoms to move around and combine and become particular things. Now, this is why we tend to think of people like Democritus and the natural philosophers more in terms of being scientific than we think of them in terms of being philosophers. The trick is he's a little bit ahead of his time in the way that he understands this atomist theory. We will eventually, in terms of science, get to a space where we understand, there are these things called atoms. Oh, and by the way, they're not uncuttable. We can cut them, and that creates a whole different field called atomic theory, okay? And splitting atoms is what creates atomic weapons. But, anyway. Where we land with somebody like Democritus is this. He believes that everything that exists, so we're talking about ontology, what is real and what is substantial, exists because of atoms and their combinations. For him, what that really means is the atom is the thing that exists. People and trees and tables are just arrangements of that existence. So atoms in the void are the things that are real. Everything else is just a combination of those atoms in that void, perhaps. How do we know this? We know this because we can look at the world and we can subdivide things. We can break things down, and eventually, logical, you get to a piece that's small enough that you can't continue to make it smaller. And at that point, we are talking about building blocks that make sense, like we build houses with bricks or temples with stones or statues, right? So we arrange these atoms, or these atoms get arranged like we arrange the bricks on houses and buildings. And it sort of made sense. And so this is how we know this. This is what we know. And then what do we do with it? Well, you can see here on the top of this page, Democritus is often called the laughing philosopher. He has a serious emphasis on cheerfulness. Cheerfulness, though, not in the sense of like silliness. Cheerfulness in the sense that you and I might talk about a kind of peaceful contentment or joy that exists regardless of circumstance. What he says is that morally and ethically, human beings can be guided by this kind of cheerfulness. This kind of contentment is a state of mind that exists. And so as we consider a right or wrong, human beings are naturally tended toward the good. This is his argument. And he says that naturally aimed at the good thing, or naturally able to discern what is good, we then come to a space where that good provides us with a source of contentment. It's not necessarily happiness. It's a kind of settledness, this cheerfulness that abides regardless of our circumstance. And that is how we know what is right and what is good versus what is not. Okay? I think that'll be a good place to take us, and we can stop here. We will pick up with this a little bit more on Monday, Tuesday, because we're not together on Monday. You get an extra day, and then we can go from there with people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Okay, enjoy your long weekend, and I will see you all on Tuesday.